Now, that agreement between Ottawa and Alberta isn't just about the pipeline. It also includes a provision for a carbon capture project dubbed Pathways Plus. That, the Prime Minister says, will help Canada achieve its climate goals.
Pathways Plus will be the largest carbon capture, utilization and storage project in the world, achieving emissions reductions that are the equivalent of taking 90% of all the trucks and cars off the road in Alberta. It will make Alberta oil amongst the world's lowest carbon intensity in the world. And it has the potential to create an entirely new industry in Canada.
Okay, an optimistic tone coming from the Prime Minister, but is what he's saying achievable under this new agreement? For more on that, we've reached out to Mark Winfield. He's a professor of environmental and urban change at York University, and he's joining us from Toronto. Professor Winfield, thank you for making time for us.
Good afternoon.
Professor Winfield, I do want to get to what we just heard from the Prime Minister, that clip, in a moment. I think the very first thing I need to ask you, sir, for those individuals, myself included, who may not understand the science, the logistics behind this kind of thing, what exactly does this mean, carbon capture? How does it work?
In this case, what we would be talking about is taking the carbon dioxide that's produced mostly when fossil gas is burned as part of the process of separating the oil from the sands, in the case of Alberta, and capturing the carbon and then putting it, in theory, back underground in the hope that it will stay there permanently.
Okay, that's an interesting choice of words, the hope that it will stay there permanently. What do we know about this technology at this point?
Well, there are multiple debates around this about how effective it will be in the very long term, because the carbon has to be taken out of the atmosphere permanently. There are also concerns that the technology has never been employed on anything approaching the scale that would be required to make a difference in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with oil sands in Alberta. So there are doubts about technical feasibility and viability of this pathway. There are also questions around the economic viability of all of this as well.
And what's the environmental impact of moving forward with the Pathways project?
Well, I think this is part of the question, is that if it is successful, in theory, the carbon stays underground permanently. But the concern is that the carbon capture is incomplete. It may not be enough to offset the growth in oil sands production that would be associated with additional export capacity. It may or may not make that much of a dent in the existing emissions, which are very, very high. And then there's a longer-term concern that although this may deal with the upstream emissions from production, it doesn't deal with the downstream consequences, that ultimately these products are going to be burned as fossil fuels and will produce carbon dioxide when that happens.
Okay, so a lot to take into account there. Now, I want to return to what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday. Now, when he's presenting this argument for the deal with Alberta, as well as the carbon capture project, he's saying that a new pipeline and expanding the Trans Mountain pipeline by up to 400,000 barrels per day, he says Canada is still on track to meet its 2050 net zero target. Is that possible?
I would have serious doubts.
Right.
It makes enormous assumptions about the effectiveness of carbon capture and storage. But more importantly, in this case, it's important to look beyond the pipeline and CCUS elements of this agreement. And crucially, there is this provision which releases Alberta from the requirements of the clean electricity regulations, which control carbon dioxide emissions from the electricity sector. That is almost certain to set off a cascade of demands from other provinces, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, who rely heavily still on fossil fuels, coal or fossil gas for electricity generation, that they be given the same treatment. And that would basically be the end of the clean electricity regulations, which are actually the single largest element of the government's current plan for achieving its Paris target. So the impacts here go beyond oil and gas. they affect other sectors where we're expecting to see large reductions in emissions. And it would seem this have set up a process whereby which that's not going to happen.
So, Professor Winfield, let me ask you this. Presuming that the Prime Minister moves forward and this pipeline does go ahead, the expansion continues, he says it's needed for the Canadian economy, considering the sort of situation we're in with the United States. What can be done beyond the carbon capture to minimize the environmental impact of a project like this?
I think that's a good question. It's not clear the impacts are mitigatable in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and then downstream, the big concern in British Columbia is the possibility of a major oil spill involving bitumen on the West Coast, where there are all kinds of doubts about whether or not such a spill could even be cleaned up. It's very difficult to reconcile this pathway with any notion that we are going to come anywhere near achieving our Paris commitments on greenhouse gas emission reductions, and there are consequences in other dimensions as well.
You sound really worried, Professor Winfield.
I don't think one can be anything but worried in this situation. As I say, there's layers to that. There is the question of the pipeline and the effectiveness of CCUS in itself. There is this concern about what happens with the clean electricity regulations, but also the wider signals being sent here around the deprioritization of climate change as a policy focus, and the extent to which that message is going to be heard in other provinces. I mean, we just heard Ontario effectively abandon its commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Much of this could be seen as a signal to other provinces that this is not a priority anymore, and that we're not worrying about climate anymore.
Professor Mark Winfield from York University, thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Great, thank you.